Welcome everyone to our discussion this afternoon for the Say Spark the Future event. Before we start, I'd like to take a moment to recognize the victims and families of the violent murder of 6 Asian American women that took place on March 16th of this year in Atlanta, Georgia. For them and all Asian Americans who have experienced violence, harassment, and hatred in the past year, we'd like to first hold a moment of silence. Thank you. Next, I'd like to recognize that all of us are joining today from native lands, and I'm joining from the land of the Piscataway people, commonly known as Washington, D.C., and acknowledge their land on which I'm with you today. We also acknowledge the land that we meet on is not our own, and we remember the First Nation tribes on whose land we meet virtually together today. Now I'll introduce myself. My name is Melissa May. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Director of Programs at APIA Scholars. I'm also the Director of the Gates Millennium Scholars Program. APIA Scholars is the nation's largest provider of college scholarships for Asian and Pacific Islander American identifying students, and it's our mission to provide resources that increase access to higher education and cultivate academic and professional success for our scholars and alumni. Today, our discussion will feature some of our scholars and alumni and will center on the experiences of these panelists as leaders and continue to engage in a conversation around coalition building across Black and Indigenous people of color or BIPOC communities. Now I'll turn it over to our panelists to introduce themselves and share how they view Asian and Pacific Islander Americans in the broader conversation on communities of color. So we can start with Ali.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for having all of us here, Melissa and Sace. Really excited and really grateful to be a part of this conversation. I'd say first and foremost, how we view the APIA community in the broader lens of the greater BIPOC landscape is such an interesting question because what it poses is it allows for difference. And I think that's a really important recognition to make is that, yes, we all have our differences, but at the end of the day, we also still fight systemic racism in one way, shape, or form. And I was talking to a friend about this, and we came back to the topic of immigration, where I think for many of us who are on this panel, we might be first or second generation Americans. But even going back to the time of enslavement in this country, there was a history of immigration. And so today, you could almost point out that the entire BIPOC community in one way, shape, or form has this history, has a legacy of immigration, and that can really tie us together when we're doing our social justice work of trying to make this land, the land that our parents know, the land that we've known, the land that our ancestors have known, a land that really represents and belongs to all of us.
Thanks, Ali. Can we go to Ryan next?
Sure. Hey, everyone. Such an honor to be here. Thanks for having this panel and giving us the spotlight to speak about our work and how we work in relation to the APIA community. My name is Ryan. I'm a second generation Burmese American based out here in Boston. Getting over the snow and cold out here. I lead global operations for a company called Harambeans, where we support African entrepreneurs all across the world. Essentially, we are the platform of choice for African entrepreneurs, and I help support the operations there. With regards to the question, how do I view APIAs in the broader community, broader conversation for communities of color? I worked in a corporate industrial software company before my current job, and I remember there were many instances, microaggressions, and these feelings of, okay, I'm the only person of color in the room, and thinking to myself, why do I feel like I don't belong? Feeling like I'm, quote unquote, an alien or somebody who just doesn't have a voice or too quiet or I don't speak up enough. And I remember there were feelings where I just felt like I didn't belong. And that's something that I'm personally working through myself, but I think this is a greater issue that as Asian Americans in the greater context of our communities, we have a voice, we have a strong presence at the table. And as leaders, as agents of change, we really do have a voice to advocate for ourselves, not only for our communities, but also for the communities of others in our society. So how I view my identity as an Asian American is I'm a leader. I'm somebody who can impact change in the room, and somebody who can, make a lasting impact by the things not only that I can do with my hands, but also with my voice and my presence in the room. So thanks for having me.
Thanks for sharing that, Ryan. Can we go to Leslie next?
Yeah, thanks again for having, us come speak. My name is Leslie, and I am, I just joined the workforce. I'm a business analyst supporting different technology implementations across US federal agencies, things like that. And I also support a lot of social impact work around like startups, different things like that, both at work and out of work. So with this question, how do I view API within this broader context of BIPOC? I think that, we have a really interesting relationship, and, going back with, immigration, things like that, is that Asian, AAPI have a really specific relationship in the sense that we have a really complex relationship with US imperialism, and, how do we negate that and think about that in the context of, the way things are for our people in our community. And I think because of that, we do have a lot of difference with other people of color and communities, but at the same time, right, at the root of it all is white supremacy, US imperialism, all those things. So I think that when I think of Asian Americans, I really think of, how do we think about, all those issues and not try to like boil it down to things like representation, things like that. I think oftentimes we do, as AAPI, get viewed as a monolith, right? And you see that a lot in the business space, right? With business resource groups, a lot of times, I've seen, I haven't been in the workforce too long, but, there's a business resource group for East Asians, but then that's kind of what's supposed to be representative for, everyone else, right? So that's just an example. There's definitely a lot more work to do, for sure.
Thank you, Leslie. Okay, Sahila, would you like to go next?
Yeah, hello, my name is Aliya Shaw. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a current sophomore at University of the Pacific studying marketing in Stockton, California. In terms of how I view APIs in a broader conversation, I feel like as someone who's been involved in very multiracial organizations, internships, programs, I think it's imperative that APIs come together in unity and allyship, because over the summer when I organized the protest for the Black Lives Matter movement, the amount of community that I saw within the API community, the amount of workshops that we discussed in terms of anti-Blackness and the Asian community and just how we can come together to uniform ourselves, it was shocking. And that's when I realized API is more than just what ethnicity you are, and it's more of how can we come together. I'm a Pakistani background ethnicity, and something that I like to do is talk about how sometimes South Asians are excluded from those conversations of API matters, of how the American system puts all APIs in one big category instead of breaking this up, really lacks the diversity within who we are as individuals. And that's how, and in simple terms, I think the way to answer the question is, for all communities of color, I've realized is API communities have been more riskier, more broader, especially the younger generation. I remember talking to my parents about the anti-Blackness in the South Asian community, and for them to kind of look at me like, what are you talking about? Like, and then seeing products like Fair and Lovely that, further portray the light skin beauty and how dark skins are portrayed as less beautiful. Those conversations I've seen some of my college peers talk about with their parents, and the stigma of mental health, and all these conversations that I've seen more of the younger generation, come together and talk about, has been very rewarding. So I think I'll wrap it there.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, so we'll jump into our second question. So what themes or lessons have come from taking part in programs or experiences that unite communities? I'm going to go to Leslie first with that question.
Yeah, that's a great question. An experience, that I always think about is my a program that I participated in, before I came to college. It was a transition program specifically made for low income first generation students. And a lot of the students were, Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so within those spaces, I think that I've never, I'm from Portland, Oregon. It's a very white city. I'd never been around, so many people of color, like whether it's in a school or an institution, right? This is like a specific program for like students like me. And so in that space, I really learned about not only like the different types of diversity, right? Like, there's Black Latinos, like things like people like that. That's just like something that was so beyond my circle and bubble before that I think those spaces are really valuable. But going back to the question is that lessons I've learned are for sure, be cognizant of what spaces you're taking up and what spaces you're in, right? If there's a conversation about, something, an identity or aspect that, you don't necessarily relate to or that you haven't experienced yourself, maybe take a step back and just let others, speak their piece and just use that space as, a way to listen and learn versus, to speak on something, even if it's, asking questions is okay, but, just always be mindful and cognizant. I think that's one of the things that I've definitely learned from being in the spaces.
Thanks, Leslie. Ryan, do you want to jump in on that question as well?
Sure. So lessons that I've learned from taking part in programs that unite communities. Although my day job is working with African entrepreneurs, there are a lot of lessons that I learned from connecting entrepreneurs together across different countries. When we bring Nigerians together with Ghanaians and Ghanaians with South Africans and sharing ideas together, there's this sense of incredible creativity that doesn't come from having all the same people in the same room. And I've really learned from my day job, it's just unity across borders is really powerful. Through diversity, there's different voices and different perspectives that it really breeds a lot of opportunity to create solutions together. So that's what I see in my day job. But in my previous job, I worked in corporate, and it was kind of different because I was oftentimes the only minority in the room. And one of the things that I was inspired to do with other Asian American colleagues was to form an employee resource group to bring together a coalition of other Asian Americans across the company of 5,000 plus and really come together to have a voice. And that was something that was really powerful because, we without a platform, we couldn't really advocate for the issues we're dealing with dealing with bamboo ceiling and microaggressions and some of the things that would go on, under the cover, under the rug. And one of the things that was really powerful through forming this group was we were able to have a platform to talk about the bamboo ceiling to our, executive VP of human resources and talk about the realities of, managers at the company are not diverse at all. And where are the Asian Americans in manager positions and where do we see, change in the boardroom? So these were issues and conversations that we started simply because we organized and formed a coalition. Because when you do anything bold, it's kind of daunting when you're alone and the only person, screaming for change. But when you're together in numbers, we had a group of around 200, 300 employees that we brought together, and there was a strength to our voices then. So I think the big lesson here from that experience is let's come together, no matter how different we may seem, or no matter what kind of issues we may differ on. I think it's important to build coalition and unite and build bridges across our differences and our similarities too. So many things we can unite on, but sometimes we don't see them.
Absolutely. Thanks, Ryan. Sahila, would you like to comment on that one as well?
Yeah, I'm gonna piggyback a little on Ryan's point. Personally, for me, I've been involved in activism at a very young age. I spent 10 years in Pakistan. After I was born in Stockton, I moved to Pakistan and lived there. So I came to the United States, no awareness of English. And a lot of the activism that I have now, it's been more within my involvement in Pakistan. I spoke up a lot about girl education rights, women rights. And when you're at the age of 9, you don't think you're strong, or you don't think you have like a strong voice. But now that I, reflect on my time there, I realize that the way I speak now, the way I enunciate every word, the way I speak probably is mainly because of that experience. And also living in a conservative village that didn't really prioritize girls' rights, educations, a very impoverished village in that itself. It led me to who I am today. And now that I live in Stockton, California, #1 most diverse city in the United States, I've learned a lot about how to be more inclusive, how to be more welcoming. How do I talk in a way that doesn't, microaggressions, passive aggressive tones? How can I make sure that I'm more empathetic than more judgmental? And I guess an experience that I can specifically talk about was my very first involvement. When I was 16, I interned for empowering marginalized Asian communities. And that's when I learned about the importance of pronouns. I learned about the importance of talking. I learned about the importance of using your voice. Because sometimes you don't think your voice is that strong until you stand in front of 60, 50 people and you talk proudly. And that also led me to my second experience for organizing a mass protest in my city, over 500 attendees. And within these experiences, it wasn't necessarily to just do something. It was to create change, to create a voice within the communities. Because of my involvement in Pakistan and because of the fact that I was the very first girls to be awarded, valedictorian positions, leadership positions, it led me to I was today in Stockton, California, which was overseeing a lot of workshops, teach-ins, discussions. How can we talk to Asian parents about the stigma of mental health? How can I talk to parents about not wanting to pursue a health career, but wanting to pursue something in marketing? How can I talk to someone who is a queer of background, and how can I help them readjust within their Asian backgrounds, as it's looked on heavily upon within our cultures? A lot of these experiences, and personally, it has been because of the mere fact that, I am a very resilient, very loud, outspoken person. And I attribute that mainly to my cities of where I grew up at. Pakistan mainly for giving me the voice that I now have today, and Stockton for embracing that voice and for, allowing me to continue change, for leading discussions, for, doing more behind the scenes work, for being here talking to you all. Like it's all a matter of time and the concept of time and how I was able to come here. So to answer your question very shortly, I would just say that the greatest lesson I learned was how you can use your weapon, which is essentially your voice, in a positive manner, and how you can lead change instead of, instead of being passive or quiet to the changes that are occurring, how you can be loud and resilient and be out there, which is quite scary, especially in a world that's very limiting. But how rewarding it can be to use your voice and see the change that you've always dreamt about.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sahila. Okay, we're going to go to Ali next to answer our next question, which is, how can building coalitions across communities of color elevate a collective voice against white supremacy?
I love that question. And I can take a current real world example to answer it. So rewind about 10 months ago here in Atlanta, in Georgia, we had the killings of Ahmaud Arbery and Rashard Brooks. And during the protest, people from all different backgrounds were showing up. And I saw that as being really inspiring, something that I am really proud of showing up when there is injustice that's happening, regardless if it's related to an identity that I hold or not. Then this past week, unfortunately, Melissa, you mentioned this earlier, we had a a killing of 6 Asian American women at beauty salons here in the local Atlanta area. And the amount of just outright support that we've seen from other communities, whether it be the Black community here in Atlanta, the Latinx community, the South Asian community, partnering with the East Asian community to show Pan-Asian solidarity, and even many people in the white community coming to ask, what can we do to help, has been really awesome and really cool. And it's something that I see is only getting stronger over time. It's sad that that's what it took in order to provide evidence for what that looks like in real life, but it is I think a rather positive sign for what's to come, hopefully, if lawmakers do their jobs. So.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to weigh in on that question? How can building coalitions across communities of color elevate a collective voice against white supremacy?
I want to add how important social media has been for elevating those voices. I am very active on Instagram, and before it was a platform used for showing like your pictures, socialize, but now I see more and more younger folks using it to repost pictures, use their voices, and it just shows that obviously you can't really dismantle white supremacy. It's been within our system for many years, generations, but what you can do is slowly like talk about it, those awkward conversations that you can have with your fellow followers. And the craziest thing is it's very surprising when I went from having 400 viewers on my stories to 200 when it was time to use my voice. So you can't please everyone. People are not going to be happy with you using your voice and for you having those awkward discussions about the deaths, about how different, how difficult it is to be a minority in the United States. But again, you also have those 200 viewers that are, praising you, who are often afraid of using their voices or just hesitant on using their voices. But I think building coalitions can definitely do that, because once you have to start somewhere. Like Ryan said, when you're the only one using your voice, it's very difficult. It's very risky. But when you have a coalition of people using their voices to dismantle such a long, difficult, element of our country, then change will come.
Yeah. Can I echo off that a little? Yeah. I think it's been really, like you said about social media, things like that. I think it's really been interesting to see the move away from kind of reliance and trust. I mean, not necessarily trust, but reliance of like establishment, like institutions, right? And seeing, I think it's been really amazing to see over the past year, all the mutual fund groups and like the mutual support has been really interesting. And I love to see that. And I think that's something that's really powerful. And I mean, you can see it in the GoFundMe's of the recent, this past week and things like that. But I'd really like encourage you to, support those around you in any way you can. Obviously, like not everything is like monetary support, emotional support, different things like that. They're all really valued for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. Thank you all for answering that question. I know it's a tough one. So thanks for sharing your insights on that. So my next question is, in working across communities of color, which similarities have you found in your life experiences or differences that you've seen in your life experiences? We'll go to Ali with that question.
Yeah, I love this question. So a few years ago, right after undergrad, my best friend from college and I started our own TEDx event. So every year we reach out to speakers, we coach them, work with them on their talks, and do all the logistical backend so that they can deliver their TED Talks on a really cool stage and platform. Things have augmented a little bit in this virtual world, but it's still been a really cool experience. And we're both Asian. She's East Asian. I'm, of course, South Asian, as mentioned earlier. And something that was really important to us was, how do we elevate the voices of those folks who are doing incredible work, but don't necessarily get the spotlight? And so in this way, we're able to work with other communities and build that coalition that our group touched on earlier, and B, also understand the needs of different communities, what they're working on, where can we plug in volunteers to be helpful. And so through that work, we've learned a couple of things. We've learned so much about our own communities, particularly the East and South Asian communities in Atlanta, and how recent new immigrants have come in the past 10 years. My parents had immigrated here in the 80s, and from the history that I knew, I thought that was kind of like the big bulk of it. But recently, in the last 10, 15 years, you're seeing huge groups of families, individuals coming alone to start new lives and seek greater opportunity here. That was something we didn't know. We didn't know about this thriving underground art scene amongst the Latinx community here in Atlanta. And now we're able to plug different people and do co-host events, whether they be virtual or in person. When incidents like this past week happen, we already have these relationships in place. So now we can host, there's a vigil happening tonight. I'm sure there's a couple of vigils happening this weekend in other locations, but now we're able to create more coalition and solidarity amongst our community, so that now when things go awry, we have a larger community and a stronger community to fall back on. The willingness that people have showed us has been incredible. How resilient this community is, and how strong their commitment is for success. It's been awesome, and I'm just so fortunate to be a part of it.
Yeah, that's so great. Elevating voices, so much learning happening, and discovering new things about different communities, all in a really beautiful platform. That's fantastic. Thanks for sharing that, Ali.
Yeah.
Ryan, can we go to you with that question next?
Sure, absolutely. Great answer, Ali. That's really inspiring, and it really touches to the importance of just having that space to come together. And it really reminds me of the quote, "It takes a village to raise a child." And what does that mean today? Our village, is our neighborhood, our campuses, our workplaces. We all have a stake in the successes of other people. And sometimes we forget that. We always think about what we can get out of certain situations, or what we can selfishly get or gain for ourselves. And that doesn't raise up any child. It just raises you up. And sometimes I reflect on that. I think MLK said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And it reminds me of the importance of coming together. And at my last job, when we're running our Asian Employee Resource Group, we actually did a collaborative event with a couple other employee resource groups, with the Latinx group, with the Black employees, around the topic of leadership and what does that look like for underrepresented groups. And sometimes, some of these issues across cultures don't translate to what leadership may look like in the boardroom. So one of the things that we did was a workshop on how to talk about your performance in the company. And sometimes, if you don't speak up in a meeting, your manager may think, okay, maybe maybe you don't have things to say or anything to contribute, but actually, maybe you're just processing, right? And you maybe express your leadership in a different way. That, as an Asian American, I always run into this problem of, okay, I'm not quiet because I don't have anything to say. It's just, I don't feel like I need to speak up right now. I need to process some things some more. And this was something we brought together as different employee resource groups, and saying, hey, what are those things that you deal with as a Black American or Latin American that may be misconstrued or misunderstood? And I think there's so much value in that workshop, because there came to light a lot of things that even I didn't see in myself. And those were opportunities to really learn about how I can, develop my skills, but also hold others with more empathy and understanding. These aren't shortcomings or anything that we should be afraid of to talk about, but rather these are things we can work on together and you know, have a constructive conversation about. So yeah, I think that's an example of working across different communities. We learn, you know, we learn, and it's a continual process. It's not, we're not going to learn about everything all at once, but having the conversation is a start to growth. And I'm continually learning. Everyone's still, you know, learning through everything we're dealing with, but yeah, that's the experience that I share here.
Yeah, thanks, Ryan. That's great, coming together in a professional space to kind of, you know, dive into what are the challenges you're experiencing, and, you know, in what ways can we support each other in overcoming challenges, and then, you know, addressing some of the bigger structures at play. Yeah, Leslie, do you want to jump in on this question as well?
Yeah, I'd love to. You know, I think speaking to a lot of what Ryan said, I think it's really important that, you know, programs, organizations, institutions, you know, whatever, they need to definitely include, you know, when they're coming up with metrics, benchmarks, programs, you know, they really need to include the people that not only identify with whatever it is you're working towards, but also the benefactors, right, of whatever it is that you're creating, because they're the people that really are going to touch whatever it is, the tool, the program, they're going to be going through it, right? And I think that that's something I've definitely learned through working out, you know, different, whether it's at my job or supporting, you know, like an international nonprofit, right? I think I've noticed that a lot of the more effective and renowned, right, programs or nonprofits have been those that have included and worked alongside their benefactors. For instance, I was able to work with a nonprofit in Colombia called La Wanfe, and their work centered around working with really young mothers, Colombian mothers, who were just below the poverty line, and, you know, due to so many reasons, right, being a young mother and not having much space in the workforce, things like that. But the organization worked really well alongside the mothers to, you know, support their needs, right? Versus just having like a board of directors that had no clue about that experience whatsoever, creating programming, right? They're working alongside these people and making it the most, you know, genuine and most genuine way possible to help them. So I think, you know, again, inclusion, you know, not just like inclusion, the word, right? Like inclusion, like in every way possible, like throughout the entire process from beginning to end, is definitely a similarity I've noticed in high performing, effective organizations.
Yeah, cultivating those partnerships and collaborations. Yeah, very important. Thanks for sharing that, Leslie. Okay, so we'll jump into our next question. So what does allyship or co-conspiratorship mean to you? And what does that look like in your work or on your campus? Just to clarify for everyone, according to Shuri Atchison, an ally is a person that actively promotes and aspires to advance the culture of inclusion through intentional, positive, and conscious efforts that benefit people as a whole. And co-conspirators, as defined by Alicia Garza, are people who actively are fighting against the system of white supremacy, and in particular, the benefits they receive from it. So just a clarification on the difference, co-conspirators kind of putting themselves on the line or taking on an element of risk when they are collaborating for a cause. So just wanted to give those clarifications before we jumped into the question. Then let's go to Sahila with that question.
Yeah, I think for this question, I'll talk about the co-conspiratorship. Sorry, it's my first time hearing that word. But I think for me, what that means to me is, as I've mentioned before, like resilience. I think it takes a lot to put yourself in the front lines to talk about something that's been very, I guess, taboo within our country. Some, for example, like white supremacy, because of our recent presidential, you know, history, how normalized it was for certain groups of people to proudly storm the Capitol, how normalized it was for certain groups of people to receive less jail time than their counterparts. And I think from a co-conspiratorship mean to me is fighting for that, fighting against those type of rights, those privileges. And I think there's a perfect quote that summarizes what I'm trying to say. I think it goes along the lines of staying silent in times of injustice is privilege. And when you're co-conspiratorship, you're not silent. You're literally screaming, you're fighting, you're working behind the scenes, you're contacting people, you're holding campaigns, you're holding itinerary plannings, teaching discussions, and then you're going to the policymakers of your city on a local level. And I can actually give a personal example of this when I actually had to, put myself on the front lines and my local Stocktonians. Best thing about my city is we have some of the best, amazing leaders I have ever met in my life. Some of the youngest, literally grassroots organizations working to dismantle white supremacy. And I was grateful enough to participate in those organizations. And last year, during the protests and movements, we didn't just protest, right? Afterwards we had 3 demands we wanted to meet by the Stockton policymakers. We said, we need to implement ethnic studies within our schools. We need to dismantle the zero tolerance policy. We need to put in more funding for our schools. So transformative restorative justice practices for our Stockton Unified students. And they ignored the zero tolerance policy. But again, we fought our way through. It did get to there, but it didn't end up pass. But what we had success in getting a unanimous vote for the ethnic studies curriculums. So now our schools are teaching those, the history of Stockton and how it's not a stigmatized bankrupt city, but it's more than that. And then we also have, we were able to allocate about $4 million for mental health services for our students. Because of budget cuts and because of the mere fact that our Stockton schools have an $8 million policing budget for elementary, high school, middle school levels, was shocking and traumatizing enough that we realized we need more services for these students that go through trauma within their lives, students that have parents who've been in prison for years on. And that's where co-conspiratorship comes. Sorry, that word is very difficult to pronounce. That's where it comes in. And that's where you have to really fight yourself through. And it's more than, yes, you are protesting. Yes, you are fighting. And yes, you're using your voice. But we realize that that's a short-term effect. We need to think long-term. How can we implement policies, changes that really, again, bring change to our city? Unfortunately, we weren't able to get to the policing aspect of our demands. We weren't able to bring our justice to those that experience, police brutality in Stockton, California. But we were able to fight for our young students that are currently going through these traumas, going through these police brutality, Asian attacks, like all of these disgusting, inhumane behaviors that are normalized within our country. So I'll end off by saying that to me, it's a lot of work. It's a lot of resilience, a lot of voice, and a lot of fight.
Wow, that's so inspirational. All the things that you did and the way that you're fighting and all of the policy that you're able to get passed. Yeah, it's all very, very inspirational and motivational work. Thank you for doing that. Yeah, so great to know that, there are people who are fighting these fights and they're within our API Scholars community and beyond. So thank you for sharing that. Great. Does anyone else want to jump in? Leslie, I don't know if you want to jump in on that last question. I think that'll be kind of on the question that I just asked Ryan and Sahila, and then we can kind of wrap up from there. Does that work for everyone? Cool. I can repeat it if you want.
No, I mean, I loved what was just said. I think that kudos to you, as a young person doing like all of that work and understanding all those complex issues, right? And I would say that I've as someone who I think being it's definitely hard when you move out of that academic space, right? And when you're faced with like other adult responsibilities, things like that, to kind of not necessarily forget, but to be immersed in that space. And I think that's definitely something that I'm definitely working towards, trying to, how do I show up as an ally, like every day, on top of your responsibilities, right? Like, I think maybe that's like a mindset that it's supposed to change. It's not something that you do on top. It's just the way you live, right? How you show up for others. So that was a great explanation for sure.
Great. Well, thank you all, panelists, Ryan, Leslie, Ali, and Sahila for joining us and really being vulnerable and sharing your experiences and your thoughts on what it means to be a leader, whether a student leader or a professional leader who does work across communities of color to create coalitions that are working to dismantle white supremacy. Like Sahila said, it's not an easy process and it's a big thing. And so, you know, in smaller ways, working together towards that is very important. So thank you all for sharing. Appreciate it. Good luck, hackers. And thank you to SACE and for inviting us to share in this space and for supporting us in our work as well. So thank you all. Good luck in your hack and have a wonderful day.